What is truth?
Truth is not subjective, opinions are. Truth can sometimes be difficult to discern, but if it were really subjective then it would have no meaning.
And how does it lead to reconciliation? These are questions I've been asking myself for the past decade. On August 9th, 2015, I found myself in the middle of a crowd of protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, to remember the life of Mike Brown Jr. and to call for truth, justice, and accountability for a life that was taken too soon. But it wasn't just his death we were lamenting. It was all of the men, women, boys, and girls of color who have been gunned down by police in this country.
What about all the other people who've been gunned down by police? Or those gunned down by ethnic gang members? Or just homicide in general?
Their only crime? The color of their skin.
First of all, this is blatantly false. Mike Brown had previously robbed a convenience store, a crime, and it's rather likely he committed other crimes before then. That alone is not enough to justify the shooting, of course, but according to accounts, Brown had attempted to grab the officer's gun, and when he failed at that he ran off with the officer in pursuit. Brown then stopped and turned to move towards the officer and began to run towards him, not exactly wounded as when surrendering, resulting in the fatal shooting. It was determined later that the witnesses who claimed he had his hands up were not credible, and the witnesses who corroborated the officer's testimony was backed up by forensic evidence. According to all evidence available to us, the facts tell us that Brown was shot in self-defense.
I know I'm an imperfect messenger for this story. The color of my skin betrays me. My upbringing along the banks of the Mississippi Delta in the Deep South indoctrinated me in the long, deep-seated racism of my ancestors.
Are you talking actual racism, or so-called white privilege?
My position as a highly educated white woman means that I cannot relate to experiences of oppression.
Okay. Knew it.
It means that I can teach about institutional racism and structural violence against communities of color, but I cannot know it because I have not lived it.
Somehow I'm guessing she won't be giving any factual data to represent her case, since she can't know it. Anecdotal evidence from people of color will be sufficient in proving systemic racism. I also don't get this phrase person of color. Isn't that what racists used to call them? Colored folk. I guess that her deep-seated, indoctrinated racism talking.
I am an imperfect messenger. But this doesn't stop me for calling for justice for Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, and all of the other African Americans whose lives have been snuffed out because of this country's suspicion.
To be fair, police are generally suspicious of everyone.
And dare I say it, hatred towards people of color. Am I speaking my truth? No.
Truth. I'm not sure you even know what that means.
No. If I were speaking my truth, it might sound something like this.
Yup, here we go with the anecdotes.
I was born in West Memphis, Arkansas.
Who gives a shit?
In 1984, to a white middle-class family. Both of my parents were poor. Their parents grew up in poverty. All four of my grandparents faced cotton to help their families survive the Great Depression. I come from a long line of poor Southern whites. Good people. Hard workers. Never relied on anyone for anything. My parents grew up in the age of Jim Crow segregation. My father lived in rural Arkansas, was at high school near the National Guard overseas segregation. My mother lived in Greensboro, North Carolina, was the rights activist against the Village Towers City. I tell you these stories so you can better understand the context of my upbringing. In 1984, the year I was born, Ronald Reagan was elected to his second term in office in a landslide victory. It was also the era in which the war on drugs began, ushering in a period of mass incarceration, described by Michelle Alexander as the new Jim Crow, because of the ways in which it effectively ruined the lives of millions of African Americans, in similar fashion to the Jim Crow era.
While it's true blacks and Hispanics are incarcerated at higher rates than whites, there are other factors in play here. Even NAACP understands this. Things such as social and economic isolation and war on drugs policies. The problem of police violence towards people of color, as you put it, goes much deeper than skin color as some perceived idea of systemic racism, although that's where the issue originated from, going all the way back to FDR's New Deal. The National Housing Act of 1934 allowed for the current mortgage system, making it possible for those unable to afford property to purchase homes. A decade later, America found itself in a new era of prosperity, and banks became much more willing to give out loans for new construction projects. As a result, the suburbs became an attractive option for mid- to upper-class families, most of whom were white, while the lower-income class minorities remained in the inner cities, compounded by a now illegal practice known as redlining, where banks discriminated against giving out loans to areas that were lined in red, the inner cities. Poverty in the inner cities led to crime and increased police patrols, and increased police patrols where criminal activity is prevalent means a higher chance of violent confrontation.
Jim Crow era. I tell you this so that you can understand the dark and often subtle ways in which racism shaped my life. The America of my youth was no place for people of color. It was a place of white privilege. And although the very same America elected its first African-American president in 2008, I would argue that America still struggles with insidious racism.
Racism most certainly does still exist, and I will even go so far as to concede that some of these police shootings may have been racially motivated. But if you're equating post-segregation America with apartheid, then you're a fucking moron.
To decry institutional racism and call for action to end it. When I was just leaving home in college for the first time.
Ugh. More anecdotes.
It was hard to imagine the world as being anything other than what I had experienced in 22 years of life. It's easy to use our experiences as a frame of reference for the world around us. It wasn't until I traveled to Northern Ireland and then South Africa that I began to see the parallels in the histories of oppression of other people. In my travels to South Africa in 2008, I learned that the authors of apartheid developed a system of racial separation and oppression based on the very same Jim Crow laws my parents' generation grew up with.
Yes, that is what systemic racism and oppression is, racism that's become ingrained in the system, aka the government or related institutions. Racist individuals who happen to be in the system, such as racist cops, do not count as systemic, albeit racism as a whole is still a problem that needs to be addressed.
This was the first time I encountered a truth that was different from the ones I had embodied in my youth. This is what led me on a journey in search of truth. Not just any truth, though. The kind of truth that has the potential to lead to reconciliation between former enemies.
The only way to truly achieve any sort of reconciliation is to address the truth, not the kind of truth you want to represent as reality.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the chairman of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, once said, "Forgiving and being reconciled to our enemies or our loved ones are not about pretending that things are other than they are.
That's true, which includes made-up bullshit.
It is not about patting one another on the back and turning a blind eye to the wrongs.
It's also not patting each other on the back for dressing, you guessed it, made-up bullshit.
True reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the hurt, the truth.
True reconciliation is also about healing, which doesn't involve digging up the past and telling people they're oppressed when they aren't.
I believe this now, but when I began this journey, I found Tutu's words confusing. I couldn't understand
I'm sure there's a great deal you don't understand.
How such a bold confrontation of reality could ever lead to reconciliation between two people, let alone healing and forgiveness.
Yeah, I don't really see how your message is going to bring that about, but maybe I'm just not as smart as I think I am.
Truth made me uncomfortable because it forced me to face realities that were inconvenient and painful. It forced me to look at the past and to see how pains visited upon people had happened in my own country by my ancestors and by the leaders of my country.
Yes, your ancestors. If you go back far enough, everyone's ancestors have done heinous things, because the human race is despicable in every conceivable way.
It made me see how institutional racism had resulted in white privilege.
You haven't even defined what white privilege is, but even reading about it on Wikipedia, the whole concept seems specious at best.
It made me see how I had benefited from the exploitation of others.
Everyone benefits from the exploitation of others, including people of color who wear Nike shoes made in third world countries, for example.
And it made me see how my silence about injustice made me complicit in its practice. Indeed.
Indeed.
It took me years to shed the racist skin in which I was bred.
But first, you had to be indoctrinated into the SJW cult
before I could call for justice against institutional racism.
Have you ever heard of the phrase, "Time heals all wounds"? While this isn't always true, in this case I think it is, at least when it comes to the emotional side of things. If you really want to help lower-income families and individuals, most of whom are visible minorities, then you need to shut up about white privilege and instead actually do something. Bring education and true wealth into these communities, not welfare and government dependency programs.
I'd like to return now to two questions that I posed to you at the beginning. What is truth? And how does it lead to reconciliation? Truth is a difficult concept to pin down. I'm not talking about absolute truths, like the fact that we all need air to breathe. I'm talking about subjective truths.
Again, truth is not subjective, but it can sometimes be unknowable.
The kinds of truths that are based on our own experiences, beliefs, and perceptions of the world.
You're talking about opinions and worldviews.
Can subjective truths be based on facts? Absolutely.
Opinions can be based on facts. Truth is the facts. However, sometimes the facts can be incomplete and thus misleading. Nevertheless, the truth remains in the facts.
Mike Brown is dead. He was killed by a police officer. These are indisputable facts that are part of the truth of what happened in Ferguson. The rest of the narrative is murky. Did Officer Wilson fear for his life, resulting in him shooting Brown?
Only the officer knows that, but nevertheless, the truth is not subjective, it is merely unknowable to us in this instance.
Did Brown have his hands up? This is the gray area where the facts are uncertain and people draw their own conclusions. Based on their experiences with police, some individuals may come to the conclusion that Mike Brown posed no threat to Officer Wilson and that he was gunned down because of the color of his skin. This is their truth.
No, it's an assertion.
Others may assert,
oh, so the opinion that doesn't fit your narrative is the assertion. Sorry, you had me confused there.
That Officer Wilson acted within the confines of the law and used his best judgment when firing his weapon. This is their truth.
This is also an assertion, but with the exception of actually being backed up by empirical data. Therefore more likely to be the actual truth and not quote-unquote their truth.
But these truths are incompatible and more likely to lead to division than to reconciliation.
The concept of white privilege is what leads to division and prevents reconciliation. The riot in Ferguson and other such places are a result of the black community believing that they're being targeted for being black, a notion reinforced by people such as yourself. That might be how they feel, but that doesn't make it the truth.
How can these truths ever lead to reconciliation between two people? How can these truths ever be reconciled into one cohesive narrative?
What is it with these people's obsession with narratives?
Let us go back to what Desmond Tutu told us about truth and reconciliation. He told us that we should not turn a blind eye to the wrongs. Instead, we must confront the truth.
Yeah, confront the truth, all of it, not just the pieces that fit the narratives you love to construct so much.
Now, imagine how much harder it must be when hundreds and thousands of similar incidents have occurred.
Look at the type of neighborhoods these incidents occur. I'm not defending every police shooting, perhaps some were a result of racism, as I said before, or at least due to racial profiling. The best way to deal with this is to change police perception of these areas, and to do so the issue of gang activity needs to be addressed. End the bullshit war on drugs. Quit outsourcing jobs, encourage entrepreneurship, do something to bring prosperity to these areas and end the vicious circle.
And we are forced to examine the reasons why this continues to happen across the US on such a significant scale.
It's pretty obvious if you don't have your SJW goggles on.
When we confront these realities, we are forced to see how our country's racist past, spanning centuries, is still present in policing and criminal justice today.
Yes, racism still exists, but there's much more to it than that. Simplistic and idiotic explanations such as white privilege are nothing to open up constructive dialogue and equated to little more than browbeating the opposition with shame tactics until they capitulate. Not only that, but it propagates anti-white racism and allows the perpetrators to separate themselves from the wrongdoing by claiming racism equals privilege plus power or some other convoluted bit of nonsense. Just listen to Black Hitler on YouTube talk as if all innovation originated from Africa before being stolen by the Neanderthal white man. The notion that only those in positions of power can be racist is ridiculous. All you have to do is look at the great Jewish conspiracy theory, whose entire premise is based upon the Jewish populator on covertly taking over society via deception through banking and the media. The racist perception of Jews as being crafty and underhanded is primarily based on perceiving them in a position of power, and it is essentially the same with anti-white propaganda.
Now, while I respect the hardworking, honest men and women that form our police force in this country, I submit to you that institutional racism in policing and criminal justice is undeniable.
Claims without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
Truth-telling, according to Michael Ignatieff, narrows the range of permissible lies. I would add to that by narrowing the range of permissible lies,
narrow the range of permissible lies. You mean censorship?
The ground is paved for an honest acknowledgement and apology by wrongdoers for the injustices they have committed.
Apologies are cheap, and to quote A Song of Ice and Fire, words are wind.
That is why it is so important that we confront the realities of institutional racism in this country.
First, you have to prove it exists. And personal anecdotes of racism isn't proof of systemic racism. You know what was systemic racism? Segregation and apartheid.
Activist. Take control of your narrative. Tell your stories and speak truth to power, no matter how difficult this might be.
What the fuck does that mean? What a load of gibberish.
Build a network of like-minded activists and strategize your campaign.
In other words, build an echo chamber and ignore anyone who doesn't reinforce your controlled narrative.
Maintain a continuous, nonviolent campaign against racism and injustice.
We should always speak out against racism and prejudice in general, but that alone isn't enough to address the issue you're talking about. The only type of privilege white people have is rooted in socio-economic status, which includes living standards where they live that goes back generations, and even so most mid to upper class families are often buried in debt. And debt is not privilege.
Don't be afraid to talk about race and injustice. Show up to support those who are demanding their rights, but don't try to take the spotlight.
Unless you're Black Lives Matter, in which case you can take the spotlight from whoever you please.
Allow your own views to be challenged. Listen and learn.
I wonder if she follows her own advice and allows her own views to be challenged. Somehow I doubt it.
And to those in power, I would say this. Give activists the safe spaces needed to air their grievances. Facilitate dialogue and look for ways to build trust. Challenge your views and listen to what is being said, and look for ways to make positive changes.
Not enough. What a lame-ass solution. If you really want to help minorities, you should be discussing solutions and ways of helping communities caught in a cycle of crime. And you don't do that by constantly talking about how whitey is keeping them down, but how we can work together towards building a better future for us all.